Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But you know, KSJE is now listener-supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast. Well, let me turn to my guest who is with us this morning. He is joining us via technology and Skype from his home in the Taos area. Paul Reed is back with us this morning. Paul, good morning.
Good morning, Scott. Glad to be back with you.
Good to have you with us, Paul. Thank you very much. And again, we didn't talk, I think, last month because you were on vacation and you were traveling around. So it's great to catch up with you. And this morning, we want to talk a little bit about the Bears Ears National Monument, which is in southeastern Utah, and kind of remind us a little bit about this great place for archaeology and all the different things that it is.
Right. So Bears Ears is an amazing place in southeast Utah. Just amazing canyons to hike, thousands and thousands of archaeological sites, beautiful isolated areas for camping, fishing, hiking, camping, all kinds of things. And this is an area that was designated as a national monument by outgoing President Obama in 2016, and then has had a very controversial history since then, as the current administration reduced the monument from over 1 million acres to just about 200,000. So folks have been real concerned about that, and this has been tied up in the courts with some legal action. What's happened most recently is the administration released a management plan for the monument, and this is what I wanted us to discuss today, because the management plan, to folks who are concerned about natural and cultural conservation of sites and beautiful places, really is inadequate. So that's what I thought we might delve into this morning.
Right, and you sent me, there's been a number of news reports about it. We're looking at a news story on our screen right now from the Washington Post, but other media have picked up on it, of course, and one of the quotes that the Post article says is calling it salt in an open wound about the management plan on this reduced Bears Ears National Monument. Another quote from a Native American tribal representative says it's like seeing that your grandmother's house has been robbed, and quotes along that line. And I imagine some of you and your colleagues maybe feel the same way, Paul Reed.
Well, right. We weren't thrilled with the reduction in the monument. One of the purported reasons for this reduction was to allow BLM and the government to manage some of these sensitive places better, because with the huge monument over 1 million acres, more management problems, again, the language put out was this is going to be reduced and then we'll focus in on good management. Well, unfortunately, the plan really doesn't specify some of the protective measures that a number of groups had weighed in on, including, 5 or 6 affiliated tribal groups, an advocacy group up in Bluff called Friends of Cedar Mesa, who have really been working with this issue for, 8, 9, 10 years almost at this point. We didn't get some of those protections in place. In fact, they've decided not to put forward a cultural resources protection plan for the monument for at least 2 more years. So essentially, the monument's going to be open. It's going to be open to lots of visitation, camping, hiking, and there aren't going to be protections in place for the archaeological sites, the cultural sites that we already know about. And there's no plan to identify new cultural sites, which, this has rightly been described as one of the richest, most dense archaeological districts really in America, and perhaps in the entire New World. And there's not enough measures being taken to do this, and this plan, continues that pattern, unfortunately.
And so for you as an archaeologist, Paul Reed, who have kind of seen, I think, some of these things happen before, we've talked at length about Aztec ruins and Salmon ruins and Chaco Canyon and things like that. I mean, with proper management and funding, these things can be protected, preserved, and interpreted. And so this is such a larger area. It kind of makes sense that they'd want to do it the right way, but it doesn't mean much without the funding to back it up. Isn't that part of the issue?
Right. Funding is another issue, and that's something that unfortunately the current administration has done now for 3 years. There simply hasn't been adequate funding released. with or without this plan, there isn't enough money in place to put in the signs and direct visitors where to go. The other thing that a lot of groups had pushed for was to do more designated camping. One of the great impacts that we have to different pieces of sensitive land, whether we're talking about environmental sensitivity or sensitivity to cultural sites, is just letting people camp wherever they want and without building facilities, and directing people to areas where we know they're not going to impact watersheds, archaeological sites, sacred sites. In this case, there's really no provision for doing that. The groups like Friends of Cedar Mesa who are involved in this had asked the BLM to put into their plan specific, designations for folks will camp here. These campsites will be developed over the next however many months and will then keep people away from sensitive areas. One of the other issues is just, how many people can visit some of the archaeological sites, because, people go up there just to camp and hike and fish and do things, but a lot of folks go up to see the historic sites and the archaeological sites specifically, which is a good thing. But to do that well, you have to specify, the total group size that can go into an area without impacting the sensitive archaeology. In this part of Utah, we have lots and lots of cliff dwelling type sites. We don't have a lot that are in the class of what we see at Mesa Verde and Navajo National Monument, but we have a lot of smaller ones, 10, 12, 14 room sites, perhaps with kivas built into alcoves. And these sites are amazing, they're pristine. A lot of times you'll find things that you don't see on open archaeological sites. But if a group of 25 or 30 or 40 goes in there, the impacts are going to be large. So this was, I think one of the common sense recommendations that had gone in with comments from our group, from Archaeology Southwest, from the Friends of Cedar Mesa, and from the affiliated tribes in the area to limit group size. And unfortunately, this recommendation was largely ignored in the new plan.
Gotcha. And of course, this area that we're talking about is fairly remote. I mean, compared to even Chaco Canyon, which I think people are, some people that aren't used to being so far off the beaten path get a little nervous when they're on this dirt road for several miles. But Bears Ears is pretty remote. There's not the nearest sizable community is a few tens of 100 miles away, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, you have the little towns at Bluff and Blanding and Moab, but it's a place where people go because they're looking for a remote experience, And
but if I have a busload of people there, that may be a potential problem, correct?
Right.
If they're not ready.
If and we've already seen this in the last few years. There's more and more people visiting, which can be a good thing, but if that flow of visitors isn't managed and there aren't enough facilities in place and directions and signs for folks, that's a big issue. So again, this is kind of a common sense thing, and unfortunately, there's been resistance to Bears Ears, of course, with the new administration coming in early 2017. So basically, very few of these things have been done. And then this plan comes forth, and we just don't see in the plan the necessary things to really protect the areas up there that require protection. And this is very different from Aztec ruins, national monuments, different from Chaco Canyon, because again, there aren't rangers all over the place up there. We're also talking about a monument that's managed by the Bureau of Land Management, who has, as an agency, they have lots and lots of diverse responsibilities. So unlike the Park Service that is focused on the archaeological sites, the historic sites, Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, on the natural resources and how to manage them, BLM juggles a whole lot of things in the work that they do. So they need adequate funding to do that in personnel, and we've yet to see that commitment. So basically, that's part of why this plan also is not likely to protect the areas that people are really worried about.
Sure, and some may say it goes back to the maybe the original designation by the Obama administration that this was done without maybe a lot of funding attached to it, correct? And to go through the proper channels to make it maybe more of a national park or other things attaches maybe some funding with it to help with some of these concerns.
Well, this has been a pattern that we've seen now. There's resistance in the Congress to creating new national parks, unfortunately, and
right. Sure.
There are areas that deserve these designations. So And what folks may not understand, and we have talked about this on at least one other show that we did, Scott, there's a long history here to considering the Bears Ears area as either a national park or a national monument.
Right.
There's been a whole lot of time put in by people having local meetings and vetting this. So, the claims that were made in late 2016 and especially going into 2017 that this was some kind of shotgun designation really just don't hold up to the scrutiny and to the hours and hours and days of work that people put in to do this. And once that monument is designated, and every other administration, we have support from the administration for setting aside these special places. So that I think is really one of the things that we've seen that's different with Bears Ears. And there's no reason not to adequately fund this. We seem to have an intersection of people who want to, or a collision really, of people who want to protect natural and cultural sites, and those who want to, really have most of the land be exploited for different types of development. And Bears Ears is a special enough place that it warrants more protection than we're seeing.
Right. And I suppose, Paul Reed, the other thing too is if you're looking at this piece of wilderness, this area that has all these great archaeological resources in them and all these natural resources and natural wonders and things like that, the first priority is to try to protect it, to put that kind of boundary line around it, to get some more scrutiny about what's going in, what's going on, what's happening inside those boundaries. And so protecting it first, and then figuring out how to pay for it, how to develop it, how to make it accessible to visitors. That's the next steps.
Right, exactly. And and honestly, if we waited to have funding in place before we planned for anything, Scott, nothing would ever happen in this country.
Well, that's a very realistic approach too. You're right. Yes.
Right, not just in with BLM monuments or any kind of development projects. We go through a long period of planning for all these different things. And a lot of times you have some seed money and then you go out and look for the rest of it. So criticisms about the process really don't understand pretty much how the government works and really how a lot of the private sector works as well.
Sure.
It's very rare that a developer comes to a community and says, hey, I've got the $1 billion in the bank, let's go do this. You have to go through these processes of planning, community involvement, and then seeing, how to meet the obligations. And a lot of times at the start of the process, you're not sure what local people really want. So if you're going to do that work well, whether it's designating a monument or building a new facility or a plant, you have to go through that public process. And that's something that, in some cases for the Bears Ears, this wasn't, this new management plan really didn't go through that. There weren't a whole lot of public hearings about this. So unfortunately, that makes it tough when a document like this comes out. But people are engaging with it, and, there's potential that we'll end up with some good outcomes. I did want to go through a couple of things that, we're looking at from a conservation standpoint that is good.
Okay.
They have gone through, put in some recommendations to close some archaeological rich areas to specifically livestock grazing and some other impacts that would really be damaging for this concentration of archaeological sites. And to put more protections in place for hiking and to tell hikers stay on the trail, don't go here, and then really basically managing some of the mechanized vehicle routes a little better than they have been managed before. One of the push-pulls that we see really anywhere where people go out and enjoy natural areas is, folks who want to do that in a mechanized powered way versus folks who want to hike or horseback ride or bike. And this is something that as our population continues to increase and, urban and suburban areas spread out, we really need to give a lot of thought to that, to how to allow people who want to just hike or horseback ride to do that and to allow, mechanized four-wheel type use in different areas. So that's something that they're considering here, and they still have a ways to go to do it, but at least it does seem to be loaded into the process, something they're thinking about.
Well, that's good to hear that there's maybe something positive about this, but I imagine the other stuff means that lawyers are getting revved up to maybe fight this in court, this new management plan?
Right. There's a comment period and input will be taken.
Right.
The real question is whether, with input that's received, if the agency, the BLM in this case, is really ready to, make any changes or go through some of that dialogue. because if they're not, then unfortunately the next recourse is some kind of legal action. And as I mentioned at the outset, there's legal action still pending just for the original shrinkage of the monument,
Right.
which I think, as we've discussed, is completely unprecedented. There's never been an administration that has done this with a monument designated by a prior administration. So, it is too bad that the politics tend to intrude into things, and we can't just get together as people who have, understand the needs for recreation and time outside and resource extraction carefully monitored and controlled. So we've kind of gotten into this corner in a way. We had been heading there for a few years, but the last few years have kind of seen more of people in their corners and saying, we don't need to talk to those folks. And, personally, I don't think that gets us down the road for protecting areas we care about and moving forward as a country.
Sure. Well, and I don't know if it's appropriate, but could we make a parallel to some of the issues surrounding Chaco Canyon? Because certainly you've been involved with that and resource development, and certainly I know the oil and gas industry, which is so important to the economy of New Mexico recently, and that has been kind of an ongoing discussion, and it seems like there's been at least a little bit more give and take between those two sides in that area than maybe this one.
Right. I mean, that's what we've been working on for Chaco as well. And, of course, Chaco Canyon National Historic Park, Chaco Culture National Historic Park, if I can get the name right, is a protected, piece of land. But, what we've seen in Chaco and a number of the other parks is if you allow development right up to the edge of these important places, then the protection isn't what we thought it was. So we have been working with a coalition of groups, with the Pueblo Governor's Council, the number of individual tribes and pueblos, and environmental partners to keep this 10-mile buffer in place. And, there's been quite a bit of pushback from industry on that, saying that they're taking care of archaeological sites they encounter if they're building wells and the like. And, but this area still needs additional protection. One of the things that's come up recently, and this is bouncing us a little out of our area, but down in Carlsbad, there have been several cases now of archaeological sites that have been impacted by sort of the real ramped up oil and gas development in the Carlsbad area. So if folks are following the National Historic Preservation Act and going through this process, then archaeological sites, historic sites, should never be impacted. Unfortunately, down there were some sites that were inadequately, studied by the oil and gas company and their contractors, and we had sites damaged. So we have to be real vigilant about all this. Is really the perspective that I take.
Sure. And does this fall back?
Where we're putting these facilities.
Right. And does this fall back to the BLM office in that area of the state that they are being, then I would imagine it is a huge influx of permit requests, right, for this development that we're seeing, and they're having to process all of these, and so, but it's their responsibility, is it not, to make sure that the oil and gas industries do their due diligence and survey these sites and make sure they're not going to be impacting anything when they do put equipment into the ground?
That's correct. I mean, the BLM office in Carlsbad is ultimately responsible for that. Without having studied that a lot, I suspect they are overwhelmed with permit requests, and that they're probably inadequately staffed. And this is another issue if this administration or any other isn't willing to fund their offices sufficiently to keep up with this development. The other thing that we're seeing is with the demand to put in oil and gas wells and other facilities down there, we're probably getting archaeologists in who may not be taking the proper time to go through this process and really protect those sites. So, there is responsibility on different sides here, but, we really have to keep in mind that as we do any kind of development, we have to do it so that we're not impacting natural and cultural areas, so that we're keeping those impacts to an absolute minimum.
Sure.
And really it takes it back to Bears Ears as well. If there are mineral resources, uranium, other resources that people are trying to get to up there, we have to manage that very, very carefully. Bears Ears really is a remarkable area, and I encourage anyone listening today, if they have time to get up there and to spend some time, because if you haven't seen it on the ground, then sometimes it's hard to envision what's going on. It's really like going to Chaco Canyon and going up on top to the site at Pueblo Alto and looking out on that landscape. the way the landscape is today, you can really get in mode and sort of take yourself back in time 1,000 years and use your imagination and imagine that as an active, Pueblo landscape back then. If we push oil and gas wells and drilling in close, that experience is going to go away. And really, it's similar for Bears Ears. If we allow sites to be rampantly visited and have, ATV traffic right up to archaeological sites and sensitive watersheds, that's going to spoil the area for everyone. So, again, I think we can keep the common sense protections in place, but like with this plan for Bears Ears, we have to put them in writing, and it has to be something that everyone understands, and then we have to put signs on the landscape and say, here's what we're doing. So this is something that a lot of us hope that BLM will step up and do,
Right.
If they're to take input on this plan, that's fine. If they're not, then they should really take steps to protect these areas.
And again, we are showing on our screen a little bit, again, from the Washington Post, some of their multimedia stories that they've done about Bears Ears, about the property and what is left as this national monument has been designated and then made smaller by the Trump administration. And again, you can kind of see a little bit, just a little bit of the landscape that we're talking about, but there's much, much more. And I know you've described it before, Paul Reed, as a simply amazing place, and it's a place I've yet to get to, but I do, on your recommendation, want to get out there, want to have a minute to really fully explore and appreciate what we're talking about this morning. There is another issue that I do want to ask you about, Paul Reed, and that is the proposal to sell off some public lands that has been proposed by another member of the Trump administration, if I'm not mistaken. And so give us a little bit of an update on that.
Right. So we do have, we had gone through most of this administration without a designee for heading the Bureau of Land Management in D.C. We'd had acting folks, but we do have someone now. And I believe this position is subject to congressional approval through the Senate. So we have a new individual who unfortunately has a history of wanting to sell off public lands. So let's see. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to pull up this individual's
Sure.
name is William Perry Pendley, who is a Wyoming native and has been named the acting head of BLM. And this is basically a person who has worked with different foundations for years as an attorney, but has felt that selling off public lands might be the best way to manage them. And this is something that those of us on the conservation and archaeological side of this really feel like would be a huge mistake. As a land steward, the federal government doesn't always do everything right, obviously, as we're talking today.
Right.
There's a process for public involvement, and that's really important. But as the big landowner, and BLM holds something like 250 million acres in the West, and for people who are private property rights advocates, this seems to be some kind of a problem from their perspective. From our perspective, this allows these lands to be protected, to be used for, under BLM's policies, diverse use. So recreation, different types of camping, fishing, hunting activities, resource extraction, with responsible use. All these different things are built into BLM's, basically their charter for doing this. If these lands went into public use, into private hands, there'd be no access for the public. If they're put into state hands, as has been proposed in some places like Utah, they also become areas that private citizens can no longer access. A lot of people think that state lands are public lands, but if you look at the way the states in the Four Corners area, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah, the state lands in all of our states require permits to access those. So with BLM lands, with forest lands in the U.S., pretty much as an American citizen, even as a visitor, you can access most of those areas. There are some that are set aside for different areas, but we're talking about hundreds of millions of acres that are available for people to recreate on and do a lot of different things. So, any move to privatize that, I think, is going to take away the rights of people to access these lands. Another thing people do, of course, if they live in different areas as they gather fuel wood off public lands. If those lands were to shift into state or private hands, then those activities as well would go away. So I think this is something that the country as a whole really needs to think hard about. And at this point, there's no pending legislation to do this. I don't believe that the federal regulations are allow this kind of a land transfer.
Right. Okay.
But this is not a good sign, essentially, for an individual who has advocated for this for years, if not decades, to then be put in charge of the government's main land managing organization. So this is just something that we have to pay some attention to and see what proposals do come out.
Right. But that does concern you, I know, and with some of the work that you've been doing on this issue and many others across the Four Corners states and beyond. Before we run out of time, Paul Reed, I wondered if you could just give us a little bit of an idea on the archaeology of southeast New Mexico in the Carlsbad area. When we talk about archaeological sites, there may be some listeners and viewers this morning who may not be aware that there are archaeological sites in the Carlsbad area, but I think we know our entire state is dotted with evidence of past inhabitants and things like that. It wasn't just concentrated up here in the Four Corners, and isn't that true?
Right, that's exactly right. So we have in the Carlsbad area, like we have in the greater San Juan Basin, people on the land since at least about 12,000 BC. So we have people through what we describe as the Paleo-Indian period, into the Archaic period, and then into the more recent, what we call formative period down there. And we have groups who sort of connected to a Pueblo-like adaptation, so they're building small pueblos down there, they're doing some agriculture, but typically what we see out there in Carlsbad, which of course is kind of in the area people call the Trans-Pecos, and sort of an extension, archaeologically, environmentally, of West Texas, is mostly people doing hunting and gathering type things. So this is a long period of people gathering natural plant resources, moving around the landscape, hunting different game animals through time. So we don't have the concentration of large sort of sedentary sites that we see in some places around our state, but we nonetheless have thousands of archaeological sites that reflect the activities of these hunter-gatherer folks through time. And again, even though it manifests differently from Chaco Canyon or what we see down in the Mimbres country, this is nonetheless an important part of the story that we talk about in the history of our state, and archaeology that deserves preservation in many cases. And if sites do have to are in the path of development, then some archaeological work and some ethnographic work with Native American groups to understand how those sites were used before they disappear from the record.
Good point. All right. Well, Paul, we are out of time. It always happens to us, but I certainly appreciate you being with us this month from your home. It looks like a fairly nice day in the Taos area.
Yeah, I think it's going to be beautiful.
Always, probably. So, great. Paul, thanks so much.
Thank you, Scott.
You bet. That is archaeologist Paul Reed from Salmon Ruins, my guest here on KSJE Farmington. And I'll be back with more in just a moment, everyone. The time is 8:40. Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.